Colorblindness, the post-racial myth. So this is definitely another form of whiteness and white privilege. This idea that we can be colorblind, that we have the option of not seeing race, and we have the option of kind of ignoring, all the realities that are caused by systemic racism. And when we can live in this mythical idea that we live in a post-racial world, now that, we have a black president, or 60s, civil rights bills or things like that, everything's fixed, and we're moving beyond. But in reality, that's more of like white people trying to just, stay in our segregated worlds and not actually see, beyond them, or what's really happening, and the experiences that people, black indigenous people of color are experiencing every day, because of the racism that we have the option of not seeing. So dive a little bit deeper, some of these common phrases that you hear a lot from white people about color blindness, about, I don't see color, I don't see race, I just see people, we're all one people. You spend too much time looking at race, often, trying to make that, blame. The problem is that you're concentrating too much on race, not that, you're living with racism. We hear that with all lives matter, this idea that, for Black Lives Matter was about highlighting the fact that many of our institutions, such policing and things like that, don't value Black lives and devalue their lives. But instead, a lot of white people actually felt left out on that, and they had to do all lives matter as a way to kind of erase, what, Black lives are experiencing. So we see this a lot, and oftentimes we see this a lot of times. And I love this quote down below. I don't see race is essentially saying, I don't see the uniqueness of your experience and the potential difficulties you face. Also, I'm a liar. Because let's be honest, it's impossible not to see race. We all see it. It's the reality. It's whether we choose to acknowledge the realities that come with what we see. I'm gonna play this. That is another clip from MTV, which we played a little the short intro to this clip. I'm gonna play another short clip of this episode that kind of highlighting this idea of colorblindness.
I feel extremely comfortable.
Half my friends are Black, and it's totally normal.
I don't give a sorry if I shouldn't be swearing, but about different colors, different races.
Yes.
I could care less what race someone is. I was never taught to really notice it.
Almost all young white Americans I spoke to consider themselves colorblind, that they do not see race. In fact, 3 out of 4 young white Americans say society would be better off if we never acknowledged race.
Most people making the comment about being blind to color, in my experience, have been primarily white. And it's a dismissive comment.
This feels like you're trying to avoid what the real issue is.
Colorblind, that's a cop-out, man. It's for people too scared to face it.
If being colorblind means running away from racial issues, well, it's working. Less than 1 in 3 young white people say they've talked about race with their family.
If I bring up any sort of race issue with my parents, they immediately assume that I'm demonizing them.
And 4 out of 5 young white people say they feel uncomfortable discussing racial issues.
It's scary and no one wants to do it. I think that's the problem.
Yeah.
All right. So I think, they brought up, some really good statistics just of how, it's easy for us to be like, oh yeah, this isn't us, it's just a few people trying to pretend to be colorblind, but this is the majority of white people in this country are trying to be colorblind, and not necessarily saying I'm colorblind, but living colorblind, realities where, 4 out of 5, white people say they feel uncomfortable even discussing racial issues. 1 out of 3 people say they talked about race with their family. Less than 1 in 3 people, less than a third of white people are even able to talk to their families, because a lot of this colorblindness and this uncomfortable feeling about race, is generational as well. So even though we pretend like this isn't about us, majority of white people are, if not explicitly trying to say they're colorblind, at least living lives where we try not to acknowledge race. We avoid race. We avoid discussions about race. We avoid, even acknowledging the negative outcomes of racism as well. So that's definitely something to think about. And so the next, next slide is a really great article from Everyday Feminism. If you haven't checked that out, it's a wonderful online media platform that's just has, I mean, it's just a world of great resources around social justice and anti-racism, patriarchy, all different kinds of issues. It's amazing. I definitely recommend following. But they have this really great article about just 7 reasons why colorblindness actually contributes to racism instead of solves it. And we're going to just talk about the first 2, but the 2 biggest ones are just, by not acknowledging color, you're invalidating a lot of things that are happening. You're not only invalidating the experiences that Black Indigenous people of color experience every day, whether all the different negative realities of racism. By saying, "Oh, I don't see color," you're saying that you're basically invalidating all the things that they experience. And when we talked about just the importance of just like understanding, believing Black Indigenous people of color, about their experiences and how important it is just to believe in them. And so being colorblindness is just kind of just automatically saying, I don't believe in anything that you experience because of your race, because we live in a post-racial society, so you must just be making all this stuff up. And also, it also, invalidates people's identities. A lot of people have a lot of joy, a lot of, resilience, a lot of, they tie a lot, about their identities to their race as well. And then that can be a really beautiful thing in many instances. And by not, saying that you don't see it, you're also invalidating those people's identities as well. And just other, and there's a whole bunch of other reasons as well. Mainly, going down to 6, it's just disingenuous. It's impossible, unless you're literally, physically, you have a blind, your color blindness, like you actually have a physical, problem where you don't see color. I mean, unless you see that, I mean, it's just impossible to see this. So let's stop pretending like it doesn't exist and just acknowledge everything that comes with the fact that we live in a very racialized society. All right, so I'm going to play another Francesca video from MTV Color about she's going to talk a little bit more about the issues with color blindness.
Poof, problem solved. Colorblindness, while nice in theory, has no effect on structural and institutional racism. Racism is a system, and that system benefits certain people at the expense of others. Ignoring it just lets those problems persist. Don't believe me? Let's take a look at some examples where colorblindness doesn't work. Number 1, preschool punishment. Let's face a fact, preschool-aged children of every race are monsters. But according to the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights report released in 2014, Black children make up 18% of preschoolers, but almost half of all suspensions. Half. And I don't think anybody believes all these preschool teachers are racist out to get little Black children, but the data shows that Black and Latino children often face steeper punishments than their white classmates for the same behavior. That's a problem. And simply believing we shouldn't see race or we shouldn't talk about race does nothing to solve this problem. Number 2, the name study. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research confirmed that people with ethnic sounding names, that's a whole other episode, are less likely to get interviewed when they apply for jobs. Meanwhile, applicants with white sounding names actually get 33% more callbacks for interviews. It's the equivalent of having 8 years of additional experience. Shout out to all the white Taquans struggling to get job interviews. And it's not just Black and white. They've done similar studies around the world, and in Canada, people with white-sounding names were 35% more likely to get callbacks than people with Indian or Chinese-sounding names. So instead of just assuming people shouldn't care about color or names, companies, governments, and schools should take the bias out of hiring and experiment with nameless resumes to, solve the problem. Number 3, renting an apartment. When the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Urban Institute did a study about real estate, they found that Black, Latino, and Asian renters were shown up to 12% fewer units than white renters. And when the Fair Housing Justice Center used actors to apply for apartments, they found that Black and Latino renters were often told there were no apartments available, while white applicants were shown apartments in the same building. So this building has a pool a laundry room, and a racist landlady. Colorblindness won't fix housing discrimination. We're going to need smart laws and a concerted effort for that. So tell me again how colorblindness is going to fix the fact that I can't get an education, a job, or a house. In many cases, colorblindness is actively harmful because it creates a false sense of security for the groups it directly benefits. The people who benefited from systemic racism can assume that they got the job or a house or weren't suspended from preschool simply because they were more qualified or just better. Ignoring race or only acknowledging that it doesn't exist biologically is not a solution to these systemic issues. It takes work, effort, laws, and new systems to undo racism. These differences may seem minute, but they're part of a very large structure of oppression that's been ingrained in us. If we can understand that we made it up, we can actively work to change it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time right here on Decoded.
All right, and last slide I want to talk about. I already read this this quote in the first class from John Halstead, but I want to read another quote about the All Lives Matter. So this is from Rachel Cargill. If you are white and you see something that is addressing the needs of a specific minority group, such as the term Black Lives Matter, and you have a knee-jerk reaction to demand the focus not be on just one group, but be inclusive of all people, I want you to sit with that for a moment. If you, a white person who nearly all times experiences majority representation, feel something negative about being left out or not fairly included, imagine how minority and marginalized groups feel all the time when their needs aren't considered in the major conversations and actions taken in this country. So when you feel the need to toss the word all onto anything that is looking to serve the needs of marginalized groups, you aren't actually asking for inclusivity. You're demanding to be centered yet again. All right, so now on the next section, we're going to talk about white savior complex. So this is another form of whiteness, another form of white privilege as well. And it directly kind of deals with a lot of colonial myths. A lot of colonial myths of this, idea that, Black and indigenous cultures, Black indigenous people of color, cultures are inferior, and they just can't, they're struggling because they can't figure out how to help themselves. And then cue the colonial Europeans to come in and help everybody out and bring civilization. It's a very nice narrative. Unfortunately, it's completely untrue. The reality why a lot of Black indigenous communities around the world are struggling is because they either had past or present exploitation from European colonial governments and neo-colonial, still to this day. The fact that there's a lot of systemic racism, there's a lot of exploitation that's causing these struggles in a lot of these communities. And then we still sell this idea that white people come in and they save the day and they fix everything because they know how to fix everything, and this community just doesn't really know how to do it, how to take care of themselves. When in reality, the best thing that white people can do is dismantle the systems that are actually causing the exploitation, actually causing the oppression and disenfranchisement of these communities of color. But instead of doing that, we turn to our white saviorism that will just focus on the outcomes, and will just bring these communities some food so they can feed. We'll help them, teach them how to farm because apparently they don't know how to farm. We'll teach them all these things. Go into these inner city schools and teach these kids, because they don't know how to. So instead of just So it's more about realizing, why these communities are suffering and focusing on the roots as opposed to just showing up and kind of giving some, dealing with the outcomes. So there's a lot of different, white savior, a lot of different forms of white saviorism. But most of it is, like I said, is when white people rescue Black, indigenous people of color from oppression that's actually caused by the white supremacy systems that white people perpetuate. So Teju Cole wrote this, the white savior industrial complex is not just about justice, it's about having a big emotional experience that validates privilege. So that's another form of it, because they're not even, it's not just about, fixing things, it's also about, a lot of times it's about personal, validation or validation of organizations or white organizations and things like that. So it can be a very self-serving experience. And again, a big part of this is not actually dealing with the root causes of these, why these communities don't have, food, why these communities are struggling with education. Instead, it's just kind of showing up and making an experience out of it. So we see this a lot, like I see this a lot, and I work in urban agriculture in DC. I see this a lot with a lot of white nonprofits. So they look at a lot of communities that are communities of color that are suffering, that don't have access to fresh food, and instead of like asking them and having meetings and seeing what their struggles are and what they want to do, because a lot of times these communities know what they need, and they don't need to be told what is best, but instead of doing that, they'll just grab the statistics of health statistics of these communities. They'll apply for a bunch of grants that are only accessible mainly to white organizations. They'll get a bunch of money and do a bunch of projects that the community never asked for, and then they pat themselves on the back and get paid. So we see this a lot. We see this as we go into these communities and say, I know what you need. You need an urban farm that's going to fix everything. You need what this and that, when in reality, like we try to teach this community of first approach, where we actually go in and listen. We don't tell people what they want. We listen to them, and we try to support community-led initiatives rather than coming in as a white organization to save the day. So that's just one form, but there's also other forms too, and we see this in media where there's like the movies like the Navajo Talkers, The Last Samurai, all these movies that about these these great stories of Black, Indigenous people of color. Instead, there's always this white person that that saves the day, like Michelle Pfeiffer in Dangerous Minds, how it wasn't for this white teacher, these Black kids would never have an opportunity. So it's we perpetuate this white savior myth a lot through our media as well, and we also use it to kind of downplay the local leaders of these communities of color and downplay their ability to actually create change. And also, one of the most dangerous myths about this is it creates this idea that a white person with good intentions can never be wrong or can never be held accountable. And this reminds me of this Instagram fight I got into. And this is just Instagram, so it's not like the real world. But there was this. So I was following someone, she just posted lots of cool pictures and stuff. So I was just following her, and I guess she wanted to get more active or have more serious conversations. So she posted just a series of all these different slides of these different things happening, factories polluting the environment, polar bears starving. And then she had posted this one slide of this, these children that were obviously looked like they were being pulled from a building. But there was nothing, there was no labels or what was going on. And then she was like, we just, this is the world. We need to have serious conversations and do something, but all it was just kind of validating this white discomfort, what's happening. And there was all these threads about people, being like, oh yeah, I'm going to eat less meat, I'm going to do this or do that. And it's all about just kind of comforting white people to not actually do anything really constructive. And so, but right before I had read this article, because this was during the Syria civil war, where the Aleppo, one of the last strongholds of the resistance of the revolutionary forces, was being just bombed like crazy, massive amount of casualties, tons of kids dying. And that photo she took was actually a photo of some of those kids being pulled from a building in Aleppo. And so I commented, being like, hey, this is some white saviorism, some privilege. Instead of just using this as clickbait, maybe talk about one thing and talk about, the organizations you could donate to and how you can help and stuff. Don't just make this a clickbait thing, kind of, to feel good about yourselves. And then I was just bombarded by all these people being, how dare you say this? She has good intentions. She's trying to do good. So, so it was just this idea that this woman, because she was trying to be good and having good intentions, it was impossible. It was just wrong to hold her accountable for the outcomes she was producing. So it was just, and that was just Instagram. You can imagine, how this plays out in the community developments and in communities and stuff. It's just this idea that, as long as a white person has good intentions, we cannot hold them, accountable. we need to get past that. We need to understand that intentions are not as important as outcomes. What the outcomes are being created is what we need to understand. So we see this, some more examples of white saviorism, like white people dominating leadership and civil rights efforts. So we see a lot of this. This is why we try to, teach people how to be good allies and not to just go into like a Black Lives Matter meeting and start dominating the meeting and telling everyone what they should, this is how we should do, we shouldn't do this or that. It's about listening and not co-opting. It's about promoting, about understanding good allyship, again, we talk about movies and campaigns and just, co-opting, experiences of Black, Indigenous people of color experiences as like clickbait, and as to kind of, I've seen people do that where they talk about, the plight of migrant workers to kind of support, their permaculture courses or something like that, or, so it's just, we need to understand that these people's experiences need to be valued and honored. And actually, if we're going to talk about it, we need to do it in a way that actually, brings help to them and not to, us personally. All right, so there's a lot of, so when we're actually doing community organizing, it's really important to understand some concepts about white savior organizing. I'm going to read this first one, again, by Teju Cole, or actually this is by Anne Thuralt, but she has a Teju Cole quote. What this is about is agency. The idea that those who are being helped out to be consulted over the matters that concern them, Teju Cole's quote, the idea that before we do anything else, the best and most important work that we can do is to listen to marginalized people, give them a platform from which they can reach a wider audience, and use the platform to help amplify their voices. This is the real work that we should be doing. Anything else and any other way of freeing women of color is the best, is at best condescending and colonialist, and at worst downright harmful and dangerous. So that's the best thing we could do when we're organizing, when we're working on projects, is just go to these communities and listen, and then support what we hear. Don't try to say, well, that sounds good, but what you really need is this. Just listen. These communities know what they want, and they know, their needs, and they know, like they know how to help themselves, and we need to believe that they know how to help themselves, and we need to support them helping themselves. But we hear this a lot when you see a lot of organizations going into communities, and they have like, some big grand project, they pass out flyers, having community meetings, and like no one shows up. And then you hear things like, why won't they just come to the table? They never show up. They don't want to be helped, or all these other lines. When in reality, when that happens, you shouldn't be like blaming them for coming to their, not coming to your table. You should, start wondering why you're not going to their table. What barriers, how are you being exclusive? What kind of environment are you creating that's excluding people or being exclusive, or what are you assuming? So instead of getting mad at the community, use this opportunity to kind of, do some critical thinking about how you can improve, yourself. And then, but beyond, but a lot of people, instead of doing that, instead of trying to figure out how to be more inclusive, they turn to tokenism, which is it's like two different, ideas. Like you see, it's symbolic. It's used for two different things. One is like you find like a Black person who supports your project, and then you make him the front person who just represents all Black people. So you get, tell him, like, here's some ideas we're gonna do, and like their opinion is what goes for the whole community. It's like a way to kind of, instead of actually doing the work to understand what the community wants, it's like finding someone to just kind of rubber stamp what you're doing, and also painting this picture that you are inclusive. A lot of times they put they're token people on flyers and things like that, so they can appear that they're inclusive, or you put someone on a board or something, and this is kind of this is often intended to create the impression of social inclusiveness and diversity in order to deflect accusations of discrimination or exclusion. So a lot of this is just about perception as opposed to actually doing the work to be inclusive in your projects, and to listen and have a community first approach to community work. And so, white saviorism, it can appear on multiple different levels. You can have that personal, which the personal idea is just like kind of how you view the world. Do you view the world through a colonial narrative that, Africa is full of poor people that can't help themselves, and I need to, help them out. Or do you view it as in the most post-colonial narrative that Africa is full of countries that have been exploited and terrorized and enslaved for the last 600 years, and which we still get to we still realize that we need to help them out, but we need to help them out and figure out how to dismantle and stop this kind of exploitation that's still continuing, which oftentimes results into like who we vote for. There are lots of candidates out there that want to have more fair trade, international policies and things like that, and want to do less exploitation. So that's what we need to like start looking for, is how we break that down. And then interpersonal, so I like this line a lot. It's the savior mentality cannot exist without turning people into objects who need rescuing. So when you're looking at these people as actually human beings that are fully capable of helping themselves, they just are struggling with systemic issues that we don't struggle with, or you're just looking at it as an object, something that you can help to, and to create experience for yourself. And the last one is more about, the systemic, that I call the neo-colonial, where I have a whole class on neo-colonialism, which is basically how, although colonialism, for the most part, has like died out. There are a few places that are still practicing settler colonialism, throughout the world. But for the most part, it's died out. But then, as most systems of oppression, they never really die out. They just transform into these new systems of control. So the same colonial governments are found lots of other ways to continue to control and exploit countries around the world. So I'm gonna read this one from Tasia Cole. Really great guy I would follow on social media. Really powerful, writes about powerful things. If Americans want to care about Africa, maybe they should consider reevaluating American foreign policy, which they already play a direct role in through their elections, before they impose themselves on Africa itself. Under that same banner, the livelihood of corn farmers in Mexico has been destroyed by NAFTA. Haitian rice farmers have suffered appalling losses to Haiti being flooded with subsidized American rice. A nightmare has been playing out in Honduras in the past 3 years, as American-backed coup and American militarization of that country have contributed to the conflict, in which hundreds of activists and journalists have already been murdered. This is a litany that will be familiar to some. To others, it will be news. But familiar or not, it has a bearing on our notions of innocence, our right to help. Let us begin our activism right here with the money-driven villainy at the heart of American foreign policy. And this really plays into, we're going to talk about this a lot in other classes, just what we've done, American imperialism, and what we've done, throughout the world, whether it's again, like dumping, heavily, having free trade agreements that remove tariffs so we can dump, American subsidized, corn and rice on countries that can, completely eliminate their own, farm systems. NAFTA, threw, over 1 million Mexican farmers out of work because they couldn't compete with our subsidized corn. And or also understanding what we've done with a lot of the Central American countries when it comes to like coups and CIA backed training death squads and things from Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador and all these other countries. So it's really important to not only understand, yes, we still need to like help these people out, give money in international community organizations, but at the same time realize that is not enough. We need to actually dismantle the policies in their country that is continuing to exploit and harm these countries. All right, and the next section we're going to talk about is Whitelash. So this is kind of combining white and backlash. So this is the idea that whenever there's racial progress, steps towards desegregation or civil rights or a black president, or eliminating slavery, there's always this whitelash that is pretty harmful, and oftentimes can actually be even more harmful than even outweigh the gains that are made. John Murray, this quote by Jon Stewart wrote recently that says, "Look, every advancement towards equality has come with the spilling of blood. Then, when that's over, its offensiveness." This comes from that group that has been doing the oppressing. There's always been this begrudging sense that black people are being granted something, when it's white people's lack of being able to live up to the defining words of the birth of the country that is the problem. and this is an actual billboard that kind of like we see this like with the growing like all this opposition towards anti-racism and social justice, that a lot of white groups will actually demonize them through like the political correctness, which was actually created by conservative think tanks in the 80s as a way to demonize social justice work. We'll talk more about that last class, but it actually tried to define that the people actually talking about racism are the racists. And that's really important to understand, because that comes from that our horrible understanding as a white people of what is racism, and that's just it's just prejudice or hatred, and if it's just hatred, then anyone could do it, and so it's important to understand that a lot of white people believe this. All right, so I'm gonna play this clip from James Baldwin again on the Dick Cavett show.
If we were white, if we were Irish, if we were Jewish, if we were Poles, if we had, in fact, in your mind, a frame of reference, our heroes would be your heroes too. Nat Turner would be a hero for you instead of a threat. Malcolm X might still be alive. And everyone is very proud of brave little Israel, a state against which I have nothing. I don't want to be misinterpreted. I'm not an anti-Semite. But when the Israelis pick up guns, or the Poles, or the Irish, or any white man in the world says, "Give me liberty or give me death," the entire white world applauds. When a black man says exactly the same thing, word for word, he is judged a criminal and treated like one, and everything possible is done to make an example of this bad nigger so there won't be any more like him.
All right. And that, I instantly, when I hear that, I think automatically about, like with just like these protests, these Black Lives Matters protests where, they're not asking for special rights. Black communities are not asking for special rights. They're asking to be treated just like everyone else in this country, and treated like, white people are treated by the police, where what, in my experience, I've never had an issue with cops, they've always been, protect and serve for me. So that's what they're asking for. They're asking just to be treated equally. And then if you look at the responses that the brutality that's come towards them just for making that ask, and that's like, happened throughout the history of this country. Anytime, Black people have strived for equality, it's been met with brutality. So a lot of this white resentment, a lot of this comes from certain ideas, that white people have. Some of them are this like zero-sum gain. As Black people are gaining more rights, that that must mean that I'm losing rights and I'm losing privileges. When in fact, this isn't a zero-sum game. This is about all of us just being treated equally. Especially when your status quo, when the status quo of this country is white supremacy, it's easy to just be like, oh, I feel like I'm losing my way of life. When we hear that a lot after like the 2016 election. I voted for Trump because I felt like I was losing my way of life. But when in reality, like that way of life, that status quo was white supremacy. So what's actually happening is more people are gaining equality, and that just feels like we're losing something. So a lot of people, as more people gain equality, we naturally feel it, especially when we're at the top of the racial hierarchy, and something that we're not, we're losing some of that. We're still at the top, but we're not as high as before. That makes us feel like we're losing something. In reality, we're just fine. Or there's a lot of issues that we're dealing with that has nothing to do with racial equality, but it's blamed on that a lot. A lot of times we blame, people of color, Black Indigenous people of color for the fact, losing, unemployment and things like that, when in reality, it has more to do with globalization, and has to do with the fact that most of our wealth is being, accumulated to the top of the, 1%, and that, But instead, it's very easy just to scapegoat and say, "Oh, the immigrants are taking our jobs," So that comes, So that's another reason why a lot of, at the beginning of this, we had Eddie Glaude talk about, he mentioned in that video after the El Paso shooting, he said, we know that people have been playing politics with this hatred for a very long time. So a lot of political parties have gained a lot of power and votes from, stoking that fear that white people are losing things because the other groups are gaining, equality. So it's important to really understand that. It's also important, we grew up in understanding that these certain systems of oppression were needed to protect white people when Black people were freed from slavery. We talked about this before, a couple of sections before, but when they're freed, white people still wanted to enslave them in other ways, through sharecropping and through terrorism, through voter suppression and things like that. But they couldn't just say they're doing that just to get maintain a racial hierarchy or get rid of their business economic competitors. So instead they created this myth of Black criminality, how all these free Black people were super dangerous, and we needed violence to control them. We needed violence, such as from lynching, terrorism, policing, the state, and they justified that, and we never have dealt with those internalizations, so most people still have that. So there's still we still feel like when we talk about defunding the police, there's a natural reaction in white people, or like who's going to protect me. And so it's important to understand that a lot of this resentment comes from the internalizations that have kind of been pushed on us through stereotypes and things like racist stereotypes. But if you look at, this is the exit polls from 2016. This is, they did one of the questions. So exit polls are generally, they generally, ask questions from after people voted for, I think it's like 100,000 or something like that. But, and then, most of the responses, these are like from 25,000 people that voted, but they tend to be very, really reflective, especially when we look at studies afterwards that kind of, they tend to be a good reflection of what people were feeling. And if we look at, immediately after 2016, I just remember all the pundits were saying, oh, it's, economic populism. It's because all these workers were being ignored, and it was about, our economy and things like that. But we can see, for Hillary Clinton, a lot of voters, that was one of their biggest issues was the economy. But for Trump voters, their two biggest issues was immigration and terrorism. And if you think about, what his platform was mainly about was, scary Islamic terrorists, Muslim terrorists were going to, destroy this country. And then a bunch of immigrants from the South who were rapists and drug dealers are going to also destroy. I mean, those were his platforms, was spreading this fear and this hatred from this. And we look at, why did people vote for Trump? And there's a lot of studies afterwards that they kind of reflect the same thing. That one is like a lot of Trump voters felt like, the growing minorities were the demographic changes were threatening their dominant status, and a lot of that came from the last census report said around 2045 white people were going to become a minority, and that really scared a lot of white people, especially people thinking that them becoming a minority meant that they were going to lose a lot of things, a lot of their privileges and stuff. So a lot of groups started feeling like as like because the demographics have changed a lot over time, and so a lot of people are feeling like white males and Christians are being discriminated against, or losing out, or are losing their dominant status. They're losing their American way of life and things like that. So, and this is a direct backlash to the increase of multiculturalism, the increase of diversity of this country, the increase of equal rights. So this is Trump being elected was a whitelash, was a direct backlash towards racial progress in this country. And we see, so Whitelash, it's kind of a mixture, it's short for white backlash. So Webster defines it as the hostile reaction of white Americans to the advances of civil rights movements. But really, like Van Jones really coined this after the 2016 election when he says, Whitelash is a new word coined by CNN commentator Van Jones to describe, in part, why he felt Americans elected Donald Trump as president. But the term describes an odd reality. Dramatic racial progress in America is inevitable, followed by the white backlash or whitelash. Reconstruction in the 19th century was followed by a century of Jim Crow. The civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s was followed by President Ronald Reagan and the rise of the religious right. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those things, and we're really going to dive into a lot of these things throughout different classes as well. But here's a couple examples of whitelash throughout the history. So when slavery ended, there was this brief moment called radical reconstruction where they're actually trying to do reparations and try to fix the past harm of slavery. Where they, 40 acres and a mule, they had, they broke apart the South into military zones. So, in order to like protect Black people and keep, white terrorism down. But eventually, white terrorism, white supremacy took back over the South, mainly when they got the army removed. We'll have a whole section on Reconstruction later, but they got the army removed, and then from there, white terrorism took over, voter suppression, and then lynching. Thousands of Black people were lynched. They had the Black Codes and Jim Crow, voter suppression, and all these things that happened. And for the next 100 years, the South was a solid block of white supremacy. So that was in direct reaction to the end of slavery and trying to create some kind of equality for the Black freed people. For 1960s, the civil rights movement, Brown versus Board, education, desegregation efforts, that the direct whitelash of that was the rise of Nixon, rise of the modern Republican Party. Nixon ran on this idea of the silent majority. There's this idea that all these, white people, there was always civil rights things happening and these movements and then these urban rebellions. And in reality, he painted this picture that the silent majority, which he didn't say was, but it implied that it was mainly all these white people around the country were losing out. So he rallied around that. He rallied, he labeled, civil rights activists, criminals, that's where the law and order racial dog whistle comes about. He used that, law and order as codes for basically brutalizing civil rights activists. And then we saw this emergence of this modern Republican Party that basically found a way to through the Southern strategy and through racial dog whistles, they realized that you couldn't be openly racist anymore. That wasn't socially acceptable. So that they created all these code words, like states' rights, law and order, welfare queens, legals, that, seem, race neutral, but in reality, they're using it to push very racist policies. And a lot of white people got on board with that. So what we see, even though the 60s feel like this, there was a lot of cultural victories in the 60s and the civil rights victories, but in reality, when we look at, the political landscape since the 60s, the political right have dominated our government, through the last 50 years. That was a direct result as a whitelash to the civil rights efforts and desegregation efforts. Then we see, LBJ, so going back to the New Deal, FDR's New Deal, you had all these great, programs, social safety networks, networks and union rights and on workers' rights, but it was all for just white people. And it wasn't really till the 60s on LBJ's Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, actually started opening up a lot of these programs, particularly welfare programs. Welfare was very, white people loved welfare at first. I mean, it started out as its mother's pensions program for widowed mothers in the early 1900s, and just kind of expanded from there. And white people loved this program until it was open to other people than white people. And then from there, we see Nixon and even Reagan, start painting this picture that Black people were using the system, that all of a sudden there was a deserving poor who were white and undeserving poor who were, black, and they started creating all these, racial stereotypes, and there was a huge backlash against welfare that we're still experiencing today. We're still experiencing, this drive to get rid of welfare, to reform it into like systems where they can deny urban areas, and so that was a huge whitelash to welfare. Same with affirmative action. I mean, we don't have a great understanding of affirmative action. I think we're going to talk a little bit about it towards the end of this section. But affirmative action isn't about giving black people, unqualified black people, jobs in college. It's about looking at people that are qualified applicants that are usually dismissed because of the color of their skin or because of how their name sounds on the application. And it's about giving these people a fair chance. But since that program was launched, in the 60s, it's just been a huge pushback, especially with conservative conservative courts and judges, about this is reverse racism. It's taken away things from zero sum gain. If like if a black person gets into college, that means a white person must have missed out on that opportunity. So and there's a huge backlash to affirmative action that's still happening today. Same with like the rise of ethnic studies and multiculturalism. All our advances, and since in the 60s, like there's a huge explosion of like social scientists, radical historians, ethnic studies in the 60s that's just been blowing up, and getting bigger and bigger. And the direct opposition to that is, the conservative think tanks created this PC movement, so they can use that to demonize all these efforts, and instead of like defending themselves from being racist and homophobic and sexist, they can now say, "Oh, I'm a victim of political correctness." Which we'll dive more deeper into that as well next class. But just we see this whole backlash to all these efforts, including like rise of new white supremacist groups like the alt-right was in direct opposition to anti-racism and social justice movements. And then with having a black president, Obama for 8 years. I mean, the Tea Party was this direct result. We paint this as economic populism, but I mean that's insane. Like, I mean, if anyone that went to a Tea Party rally knows this is straight up racism. Like they were effigies of the black president, they would hang and burn. Like the signs were so racist. I mean, it was, and they were just being fed these talking points and these narratives from bigger institutions, like because. So about a lot of this, was a backlash to the black president, and we see this, many people think that Trump was a whitelash to President Obama, but. So I want to actually, to kind of go on that last thought, I want to talk about a little bit, or play this video about Nicole Hannah-Jones. She's an amazing person. She created the 1619 Project. This is during the night of election when they just found out Trump won. She's on Democracy Now, and she's talking about how this was a whitelash.
Nicole Hannah-Jones. We are going from the first African-American president in the United States to a president supported by the Ku Klux Klan. Your thoughts?
Well, I think if one studies history, this is not a surprising outcome. I've been tweeting about this all morning. You look at what happens after the Civil War, after Lincoln's assassination. You get Grant and then you get Hayes. And Hayes basically returns the white South to power and ends Reconstruction. You look at Lyndon B. Johnson, who, of course, passes and helps pass the most expansive civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. And we replace him in this country with Richard Nixon, who runs on a Southern strategy that plays on the racial fears of white Southerners and white ethnics in the North. And they quickly roll back and decide that they're not going to enforce key civil rights legislation. And now we have the first black president, and he gets replaced with someone who has been endorsed by white supremacists, white nationalists, and the KKK. So I think while a lot of people are reeling, I think that this is probably a very unsurprising outcome when you look at history. Whenever there are great strides towards racial progress in this country, there is a white backlash, and we're in the middle of that. And I think the media coverage that is trying to call this an issue of working class without saying white working class, when we know that Black, Latino, brown working class did not vote for Donald Trump, is dishonest. I think also that we know that, at least from preliminary results, Trump won across the board with white voters, with educated white Americans, middle-class white Americans, that it was not just white folks who didn't know any better. So I think there's a lot of soul searching that needs to be done. But I also think that this election is very American.
What do you mean American?
Like I just said, if you look at history, this is unsurprising. This has been a country that has never been comfortable with racial progress for ethnic and religious minorities, and still is not so.
Right. And if you haven't read this book, this is a really fantastic book. It's called White Rage. A lot of the things that I talked about, it kind of dives really deep into a lot of like the white rage, the white backlash, the whitelash of our history, starting from the the end of slavery and the Civil War to now. So I definitely recommend it. It's a really fantastic book. There's a great, a quote from this book that I want to read from Carl Anderson. The trigger for white rage inevitably is Black advancement. It is not the mere presence of Black people that is a problem. Rather, it is Blackness with ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, and with demands for full and equal citizenship. It is a Blackness that refuses to accept subjugation, to give up. A formidable array of policy assaults and legal contortions has punished Black resilience, Black resolve. And all the while, white rage manages to maintain not on upper hand, but also apparently the moral high ground. It's Giuliani chastising Black people to fix the problems in their own neighborhoods instead of always scapegoating the police. It's the endless narratives about culture of Black poverty that devalues education, hard work, family, ambition. It's the mantra told so often that some African Americans themselves have come to believe. Few even think anymore to question the stories, the studies of Black fathers abandoning their children, or rampant drug use in Black neighborhoods, or African American children hating education because school was acting white, all of which has been disapproved but remain foundational in American lore. And a lot of these things, we're going to talk more of this next class in internalizations and stereotypes, but a lot of these stereotypes appeared after, the 60s, after the civil rights bills passed. And so, a lot of people, particularly on the political right, kind of sold this narrative. But now that we have these civil rights bills that outlawed, explicit racism like Jim Crow, that racism was over, Martin Luther King's dream came true, and then any problems are personal, are now the personal responsibility of these communities of color, and they created these myths, and not just for political right. Lyndon Johnson also, I can't remember the name. We'll talk more about this tomorrow, next week, but he commissioned this report that and the guy, the researcher who was doing this. Came up with this conclusion that Black communities are suffering, because of, cultural poverty, because of cycle of poverty, that because of an inferior Black culture, because he talked a lot about the absentee Black father and how, Black families are the matriarchy is dominant and pushes away the Black fathers, and it was just like crazy to read. But I mean, this became, this became the Bible for the next 50 years when we're looking at poverty and creating this myth of welfare dependency and all these things. And then since then, we've proven like all the stuff wrong, like especially like the Black absentee father. It was based on bad data where we were looking at, it was like they were just looking at whether the Black fathers were living in the same home as their family, because at that time, nuclear family, if you weren't, on the traditional Christian family, there must be something wrong. But in reality, like since then, the CDC has done a bunch of reports in the last decade, and they found that yes, Black fathers are more likely to not live in the same home as their children, but that does not mean at all they're not, present in their child's life. In fact, the CDC actually found Black fathers on average were more present in their children's lives than white fathers, regardless of whether they live in the same home or not. But we created all these myths and legends to kind of justify, really horrific policies, over the last 50 years of mainly of disinvestment into Black communities and kind of finding clever ways to cut them out of social service programs. And a lot of these, you know, so again, we have these like narratives that we kind of push, these white resentment narratives. You know, a big one we talked about is like losing the way of life. You know, you get that a lot when we see changing demographics, we see more diversity. You know, that MTV guy, you know, talked about like in this community, it just didn't look like, you know, it was a white community anymore, you know, so just feeling that, you know, that integration, you know, that this isn't a white country anymore, you know, and or the idea of reverse racism, that, you know, programs like affirmative action and Black Lives Matter, and racial, you know, racialized scholarships are, you know, even though they're just to, you know, kind of attempt to kind of even the playing field. Even with all this stuff, white people still get most of the scholarships and still get most of the jobs, but these things kind of help a little bit. But white people look at it, even, you know, they're dominating all this stuff, they still look at it as like reverse racism. They're being discriminated against. This idea of zero-sum gain, you know, like people gain, you know, if minorities gain, you know, then that means that I'm losing something. You know, this feeling of being under attack. You know, a lot of white supremacist groups, you see it. I mean, they chant these things: "We will not, you know, you will not replace us." You know, all these things, and like, because there is this idea when we start dismantling, you know, Confederate statues. That's to actually correct, you know, a made-up history that we tell. That's not to replace white people, but white people see that as a direct, you know, confrontation, that they're being replaced. When in reality, those statues had nothing to do with the real history that we've gone through. You know, all these like false beliefs and narratives about, you know, if Black people are on welfare, they must be abusing the system, as opposed to they actually, you know, these are actually good programs that are helping with the realities that Black communities are facing. You know, or immigrants are taking our jobs, when in reality, like it's you know, globalization, you know, it's a lot of other things that you know, it's accumulation of wealth, you know, to the rich. It's a lot of things that, you know, mechanization, you know, mechanizing everything. You know, so or racial dog whistles again. You know, as we keep on saying, like when especially like illegals, they keep on saying illegals. First of all, it's not illegal to be in this country undocumented. It's like a civil offense. You know, but when you call them illegals, you're just pushing this idea that they're actually harmful, and we need to get rid of them because they're, you know, must be, you know, criminals. You know, they're trying to criminalize immigrants so they can push their immigration policies, which in reality make a lot of their donors super rich with all their, you know, immigration, you know, prisons and things like that. So we have to understand, you know, kind of get past a lot of this. And we're going to talk more about like the demonization of social justice next class. But I really like this quote where Rachel Cargle talks about equality feels like oppression to those who have always been privileged. So I think that quote really summarizes it really well. And that, you know, so we keep on saying these ideas like privilege as a zero-sum game. Like one of the people on the MTV Look Different said, when a person receives a benefit like a scholarship, it feels like something is taken away from white people. I actually like looked up, you know, in financialaid.org, or aid.org, you know, has a lot of racial data on this, and even, you know, the majority of undergrads, majority of people that benefit from, you know, even with all these programs like affirmative action, you know, and scholarships, white people are still dominating, you know, on the financial aid. They're still dominating on jobs and getting into colleges and things like that. Michael Harrod wrote this that summed it up really well. It is easier for a white man with a criminal record to get hired than it is for a Black man with no criminal record. According to Pew Research, even when adjusted for education and experience, the Black employment rate is consistently twice that of whites. Even having a Black name can make one unhireable. All of this is true even with affirmative action mandates in place. So even like the, you know, so even with affirmative action, even with all these programs, white people are still dominating, but they still feel like any program that tries to bring justice or equality is taking something away from them. And that, a lot of that comes with this, you know, a lot of people, you know, have demonized affirmative action and sold these bad myths about it. If we could just take a second to talk about affirmative action, what it really is. As I was saying earlier, it's not about giving unqualified minorities jobs in college, you know, education. It's about finding, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color who all are qualified, but are usually, you know, they're not considered because of their race, and giving them them equal opportunity. There's no quotas, there's no preferential treatment. It's just about giving these qualified candidates the opportunity to actually, be on the equal chance to actually get into college or to get in, a job. And this only applies for public companies and public colleges. So, I mean, there's a lot of places where this does not apply at all. And when, and overwhelmingly, like the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action is white women. So Lyndon Johnson, I think it's like Kennedy created affirmative action, but then Johnson added, some amendments that included women to it. So even with this program, still benefits white people more than it benefits people of color. But yet it's still used, as a focal point to kind of demonize any kind of efforts to deal with, dismantling systemic racism in our society.